Thanks for the download. Before we crack on, it'd be great if you could rate the podcast on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from, as this helps me know how we're doing and if the content is hitting the mark. If you do like the pod and like to support it, then you can check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, and you can help me cover ongoing costs such as website hosting. The subject of this podcast is the Derryard action, a sustained IRA deliberate attack that took place in December 1989. And this was against an Army permanent vehicle checkpoint known as a PVCP, close to the border with the Republic, a few miles north of Rosslea in County Fermanagh. The checkpoint was manned by members of the King's Own Scottish Borders Regiment, who fought off an ASU, an active service unit, that considerably overmatched them with weapons. During my research, I discovered that the former Warrant Officer Class 2 Robert Duncan, who was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his actions that night, had sadly passed away on the 5th of May. This episode is dedicated to him, along with Private James Houston 22 and Lance Corporal Patterson 21, who were both killed in action. I considered getting a former member of the battalion who took part in the contact on the podcast, but decided against it. Despite those soldiers fighting so courageously and within the rules of engagement that winter's night, the threat of legacy prosecutions that hangs over NI veterans dissuaded me. Northern Ireland is a campaign fading rapidly in our collective memory, especially these days when Sinn Féin is controlling the narrative and whitewashing terrorist activity. Yes, we made mistakes, especially in the early days, but very few armies could have conducted themselves as well under such demanding circumstances. And we forget how bloody Northern Ireland was. 3,500 killed during the Troubles, 1,441 of them belonged to the security forces, and in 1972 alone, 130 members of the security forces were killed. On my tour in London during 1988, we had 2 killed in action and half dozen wounded, some with life-changing injuries, and a unit of around 100 soldiers. Pyra like to plant bombs and shoot people in the back. However, as much as it sticks my throat to say it, they could also be brave, determined and resourceful in their operations. Warren Point is a good example of a complicated, well-planned ambush taking place on the 27th of August 1979, when soldiers of the Parachute Regiment, travelling in a convoy, were hit by IEDs. The first device was aimed at the convoy itself, and the second was set to go off at the ICP, the Incident Control Point. IRA volunteers hidden in a nearby wood also engaged troops to return fire. 18 British soldiers were killed, including the CO of the Queen's Own Highlanders, and over 20 were seriously injured, making it the deadliest attack in the British Army during the Troubles. A civilian was also killed and an Irish civilian wounded, both by British soldiers firing across the border after the first blast. And on the same day, the IRA assassinated Lord Mountbatten and killed 3 others. Like Warren Point, Derryard was a well-executed, complicated, deliberate attack, pressed home by a determined, well-armed enemy against trained soldiers in a fixed defensive position. After the attack, a senior military officer was quoted as saying, "They are murdering bastards, but they are not cowards." This team actually pressed home a ground attack right into the heart of the compound. That takes guts when there are people firing back. So, who were these terrorists and what motivated them? Volunteers of the IRA in the 80s were on the whole probably much like their British Army soldier counterparts. Early school leavers drawn from the working classes, young and highly motivated for their respective causes. Like soldiers, they were generally unwise to the realities of taking up arms in a vicious counterinsurgency. Unlike soldiers, they knew that they would be responsible for the illegal, though they considered legitimate, killing of civilians and members of the security forces. The IRA also had their own doctrine enshrined in a document called the Green Book. In his study of the IRA, Tim Pat Coogan stated, "While it dealt with all the aspects of training and the movement's aim, it clearly regarded the most important thing for a volunteer as being not so much what he carried in his hands, or what shape the organisation took, though such considerations are crucial, but what he carried round in his head and heart." Any naive expectations a potential recruit might have held are quickly dispelled early on when they read the following in the Green Book.
Before any potential volunteer decides to join the Irish Republican Army, he should understand fully and clearly the issues involved. He should not join the Army because of emotionalism, sensationalism, or adventurism. He should examine fully his own motives, knowing the dangers involved, and knowing that he will find no romance within the movement. Again, he should examine his political motives, bearing in mind that the Army are intent on creating a socialist republic.
In addition, one of the first chapters of the Green Book attempts to justify the legal and moral cause of the armed struggle against the forces of the Crown.
The Irish Republican Army, as the legal representatives of the Irish people, are morally justified in carrying out a campaign of resistance against foreign occupation forces and domestic collaborators. All volunteers are, and must feel, morally justified in carrying out the dictates of the legal government. They, as the Army, are the legal and lawful army of the Irish Republic, which has been forced underground by overwhelming forces.
In another chapter, the volunteers soon warned about the realities of life in an underground army.
Volunteers are expected to wage a military war of liberation against a numerically superior force. This involves the use of arms and explosives. Firstly, the use of arms. When volunteers are trained in the use of arms, they must fully understand that guns are dangerous, and their main purpose is to take human life. In other words, to kill people. And volunteers are trained to kill people. It is not an easy thing to take up a gun and go out to kill some person without strong convictions or justification. The Army, its motivating force, is based upon strong convictions which bonds the Army into one force, and before any potential volunteer decides to join the Army, he must have these strong convictions. Convictions which are strong enough to give him confidence to kill someone, without hesitation and without regret. The same can be said about a bombing campaign. Again, all people wishing to join the Army must fully realise that when life is being taken, that very well could mean their own. If you go out to shoot soldiers or police, you must fully realise that they too can shoot you. Life in an underground army is extremely harsh and hard, cruel and disillusioning at times. So before any person decides to join the Army, he should think seriously about the whole thing.
The Green Book even attempts to outline a long-term vision for the cause.
A new recruit's immediate obstacle is the removal of his or her ignorance about how to handle weapons, military tactics, security and interrogations. An officer commanding's might be how to put a unit on a military footing. An intelligence officer's how to create an effective intelligence network. A Q-man chairman's how best to mount a campaign on a given issue, for example the H-blocks, and for all members of the movement, regardless of which branch we belong to enhance our commitment to and participation in the struggle, through gaining as comprehensive an understanding as possible for our present society and the proposed Republican alternative through self and group education.
Coogan succinctly sums up the publication. The approach to the Green Book is a cunningly thought-out mixture of philosophy and guide to action. Each lesson or lecture is in part repetitious and part of thinking forward to the next stage. Constant preoccupation with the problem of how to win friends and influence people while at the same time killing others and setting off explosions. Thus indoctrinated and trained, the volunteer would be ready to deploy in operations. But who were the terrorists that carried out the attack? Planning the operation was thought to have been the responsibility of Thomas Slab Murphy, who was thought to have been a member of the South Armagh Brigade of the IRA before being elected Chief of Staff by the IRA Army Council. He was suspected of planning the Warrenpoint ambush and implicated in the killing of Lord Mountbatten. He was also involved in smuggling large weapon shipments from Libya in the 1980s and was a man with a notorious reputation. He was finally jailed in 2016, not for terrorist offences, but, like Al Capone, the Chicago gangster, for tax evasion. A report in the Herald of Scotland shortly after the attack quoted an army officer who summed up the enemy forces as follows.
The opposition in the border and rural areas is recognised by the army as a potent and professional enemy. They seldom mount spur-of-the-moment attacks, relying on detailed reconnaissance, meticulous planning and maximum firepower to strike at police or army patrols and bases. In Fermanagh, raids are usually carried out by active service units based south of the border, and for every terrorist trained to use a gun or assemble a bomb, there are perhaps 3 supporters prepared to act as couriers or lookouts and providers of transport and shelter. Tyrone is a different proposition entirely. There, the hardcore terrorists live locally. Major Bob Andrew, the KOSB garrison commander at Cookstown, explained, "The provos in Belfast or Londonderry tend to stage incidents timed to catch the 6 o'clock news. The people down here are out to inflict casualties on us. They are a harder breed entirely and very, very dangerous. This has always been a committed Republican area. The cowboy element was caught or shot years ago. What we have now is an experienced professional enemy with enormous local support. They should never be underestimated."
The SU that attacked Derryard considerably outgunned the defenders and were armed with AK-47s, AR-18s, 2 Dushka heavy machine guns, RPG-7s, grenades and an LPO-50 flamethrower. So where did these weapons and explosives come from? At the start of the Troubles in 1969, Provisional IRA was poorly equipped, relying on weapons from previous campaigns that were in the main obsolete, but no less effective for that. However, they badly needed access to modern and military-grade weapon systems. As a result, they turned to the US and Libya, who supplied the bulk of weapons to the IRA. The main source in the States was an Irish Republican called George Harrison, whose operation was stopped by the FBI in the early 80s. Other attempts were made to smuggle weapons via different routes, but many failed as the FBI, who formed a special unit to counter Irish paramilitaries and other law enforcement agencies, were able to conduct operations against the smugglers. In 1976, a Senate subcommittee noted that the role of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, the ATF, in prosecuting IRA gun runners stated,
"Since September 1971, the ATF has been involved in investigating Irish Republican Army gun-running activities in the United States. Numerous successful prosecutions of Irish Republican Army gun runners violating the Gun Control Act have resulted. Most notable and significant to date was the recent conviction in Baltimore, Maryland, of 5 gun runners charged with 23 violation counts of the 1968 Gun Control Act, including using fictitious names, counterfeiting federal firearms licenses, and illegally transporting firearms and explosive devices across state lines. Seized from the defendants were 70 of the 158 illegally purchased Colt AR-15 semi-automatic rifles destined for the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland."
Outside America, a BBC report wrote that Muammar Gaddafi, who took over Libya in a 1969 coup, saw the IRA as a comrade-in-arms fighting British imperialism, and he was partly responsible for providing it with more modern weaponry. The first proven connection with Libya was discovered in 1973 when the Irish Navy boarded a ship called the Claudia off the Irish coast. They found 5 tons of weaponry supplied by Libya, and links between Gaddafi and the IRA re-emerged in 1986 after Gaddafi's adopted daughter was killed along with more than 100 other people by US bombing raids launched from UK bases. A year later, French authorities stopped a ship, the Excond, which was on its way to Northern Ireland, carrying around 1,000 AK-47s and more than 50 ground-to-air missiles and 2 tons of Semtex. So, all told in the 80s, an estimated 4 shipments of weapons were supplied to the IRA by Gaddafi and were estimated to have the potential to equip 2 infantry battalions. These included heavy machine guns, over 1,000 rifles, several hundred handguns, rocket-propelled grenades, flamethrowers, surface-to-air missiles and Semtex. From late 1986 onwards, it is thought that virtually every bomb constructed by Republican terrorist groups contained Semtex from Libya. All terrorist operations require money, and the IRA campaign was no different. Again, the United States and Libya assisted with this. A CIA report in 1985 stated,
NORAID was founded and directed by Michael Flannery, who in the 1920s was an IRA member in the North Tipperary Brigade, and has provided the Republican movement in Northern Ireland with its largest regular source of American funds, $2 million to $3 million since 1970, and unstinting moral support from a vocal minority of Irish Americans who openly support the IRA. An RUC spokesman says the IRA's control over NORAID appears to be persuasive rather than direct, but he adds, the direction and control is there. Again, Flannery denies any connection to the IRA. What he doesn't deny, however, is that he approves of the smuggling of guns to the IRA, and that he was prepared to finance gun-running deals.
This is, however, dwarfed by the money supplied by the Gaddafi regime. In 2021, RTE News reported the massive scale of Libya's support for the IRA in the 1970s and 80s is outlined in secret documents released by the National Archives today. As well as huge amounts of armaments, Colonel Gaddafi's regime also supplied the Provos with over $12.5 million in cash, the equivalent of roughly 40 million euros today. British intelligence was shocked to discover just how much money was involved when Libya finally decided to come clean on the extent of its support for the Provisional IRA in the summer of 1992. While admissions about arms shipments were broadly in line with expectations, the British authorities were unnerved to discover that Libya has given PIRA far more money than we had thought. Despite the socialist aims of the Provos, as set out in the Green Book, it's clear that not all this money went to the cause. In 2005, the BBC reported on an asset swoop on 250 properties in the Greater Manchester area worth an estimated £30 million and thought to be linked to the IRA, and this was during a probe into the affairs of Slab Murphy. On the 17th of October 2008, in an agreed legal settlement, Murphy and his brothers paid over $1 million in assets and cash to authorities in Britain and the Republic in settlement of a global crime and fraud investigation relating to proceeds of crime associated with smuggling and money laundering. After an investigation involving the Irish Criminal Assets Bureau and the UK's Serious Organised Crime Agency, more than £487,000 in cash and cheques was confiscated by the Republic's courts, while 9 properties in northwest England worth a further £445,000 were confiscated by British courts. It seems that, to suppose Farmer Murphy, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Derryard represents a change in tactics for the IRA, for which they look to the past. In 1920, IRA General Headquarters issued a memo concerning the use of flying columns.
At the present time, a large number of our men and officers are on the run in different parts of the country. The most effective way of utilising these officers and men would seem to be by organising them as a flying column. In this way, they would become available as standing troops of a well-trained and thoroughly reliable stamp, and their action could be far more systematic and effective. Permanent troops of this kind would afford an exceedingly valuable auxiliary arm to the remainder of the Republican Army, which is in great measure only a part-time service militia. These flying columns would consist of only first-rate troops, as the work required of them will be very exacting.
The duties of flying columns would consist of 2 distinct types of action, auxiliary and independent. Auxiliary action meant that commanders would be able to assign the flying column as an extra force for local attack in his area. Independent action would comprise attacks on government forces or assets. According to the journalist Ed Maloney, the IRA Army Council, knowing that the organisation had been penetrated by multiple agents, decided to form a flying column instead of using a local ASU to attack Derryard. The column composed of 20 men from throughout Northern Ireland, and around 12 took part in the attack. By using this tactic, they hoped to enhance operational security and prevent a repeat of the Loughgall incident in 1987, where an IRA unit attempted to attack an RUC police station, but was ambushed by the SAS and 8 terrorists were killed. Security sources believe that IRA members from County Tyrone and South Monaghan in the Republic took part in the attack, and in January 1990 the Glasgow Herald reported that, according to intelligence sources, the leader of the attack was an Irishman and former NCO in the British Army who'd served in the Parachute Regiment. Following the attack on the PVCP, the following account of the action was published on the KOSB Battalion Part 1 orders.
On the 13th of December 1989, PVCP Derryard, north of Rosslea, 2 kilometres from the Fermanagh-Monaghan border, was manned by 2 teams from Support Company 1 KOSB. The commander was Corporal Duncan. The second in command was Lance Corporal Patterson, and the other members of the teams were Privates Gray, Harvey, Houston, Lansdell, Sloane and Whitelaw. That day, as a result of an unspecific threat to all border locations, The PVCP had been reinforced by an additional support company team commanded by Corporal Harvey with Privates Dunn, Common and Maxwell as team members. As normal, the PVCP was operated by 4 men. Corporal Duncan in the command Sangar, Private Whitelaw in the rear observation Sangar, Private Houston, the roadman, checking vehicles, and Private Harvey as runner. A visitor, Staff Sergeant Bradley of the Royal Engineers, was in the command Sangar carrying out maintenance work. Lance Corporal Patterson and his team were off duty and asleep in one of the 3 small porter cabins. Corporal Harvey's team were on an external security patrol. At 16:20 hours, the Provisional IRA attacked the checkpoint in considerable force. It is clear that the enemy had good knowledge of the layout, manning levels and routine of the PVC, undoubtedly built up over many months of reconnaissance. For the terrorist, it was a soft target, being tactically indefensible, poorly protected, and manned with a minimum of weaponry. The IRA brought with them the manpower, weapons, vehicles, and explosive devices to destroy the base, which was their intent. They had not counted on the fighting spirit, training, and natural aggression of the Jocks, and did not know Corporal Harvey's team were in the area of the base. The enemy failed in their mission. At least 12 terrorists were concealed under a tarpaulin in the back of a Hino flatbed lorry. The sides of the lorry had been built up and protected with spaced compressed sand. A crash bar had been fitted, as had mountings for 2 machine guns and external armour plates. A second vehicle, an Isuzu van, contained a 240-kilogram bomb. The terrorists were armed with 6 RPG-7 rockets, a flamethrower, 6 Armalite and AK-47 rifles, 2 machine guns and several fragmentation grenades. The lorry approached from the direction of the border and stopped in the PVCP road area. It was seen and reported by Private Whitelaw and Corporal Harvey's team, who were on the high ground 500 metres to the north. Corporal Duncan instructed Private Houston to check the back of the vehicle. The lorry sounded its horn, at which Private Whitelaw, who was observing his other arc, turned around to see the enemy attack launched. Simultaneous automatic gunfire killed Private Houston, suppressed the command and observation Sangars, and sprayed to the thinly protected walls of the base. Grenades were thrown into the base. Flame was fired at the command Sangar. 2 RPG-7 were fired at the observation Sangar, both hit, and the Sangar was destroyed. Heavy suppressive fire continued as the lorry was reversed and smashed its way through the gates into the compound and was then driven out of the base. The Isuzu van was driven in and the bomb primed. At least 3 terrorists dismounted with flame, gunfire and grenades systematically set about clearing the porter cabin. As the enemy attack started, Corporal Duncan immediately returned fire from the command Sangar. He continued to do so until forced to withdraw under the weight of fire and flame that was splintering the Sangar walls and penetrating inside the Sangar through the observation ports. He ordered Staff Sergeant Bradley to move under cover to the rear of the base. Private Whitelaw was thrown to the ground inside the observation Sangar as the structure broke apart and the upper floor collapsed. He suffered minor blast burns from the exploding rockets. As he recovered his senses, he saw an unexploded grenade at his feet. He kicked it away. The grenade exploded harmlessly. A second grenade exploded, causing him multiple minor fragmentation injuries in his side and back. As the enemy sprayed the base with gunfire and grenades and smashed the lorry into the compound. Corporal Duncan, still firing, crossed through the fire to check all the porter cabins and to order his men to regroup behind cover at the rear of the base. He checked the observation Sangar, but Private Whitelaw was not there. He moved to the rear gate. Inside the kitchen porter cabin, Private Harvey was pinned down. Inside the accommodation porter cabin, Lance Corporal Patterson and his team awoke as the attack started. He ordered the men to put on their helmets and flak jackets, grab their weapons, and stay under cover. Lance Corporal Patterson left by the rear door. He moved to the observation Sangar, where he found Staff Sergeant Bradley helping the injured Private Whitelaw. The 2 men moved him back into the accommodation. Lance Corporal Patterson left the accommodation again and moved round into the compound, where he was killed by gunfire. By this time, Corporal Duncan was fighting his way to the observation Sangar and back to the rear gate. Finding no one there, he moved into the compound to discover the body of Lance Corporal Patterson. The terrorists had just withdrawn, still firing automatic weapons, and another RPG-7 at the base. He ordered his soldiers to give first aid, check for casualties, and get to the radio in the command Sangha. He moved to the front of the base to check for Private Houston. Following the sighting of the Hino lorry, Corporal Harvey and his team were moving down towards the PVCP from the north when the attack began. Corporal Harvey's contact report at this time was critical. It was the only ROE message received by battalion headquarters until after the action. It allowed the essential redeployment of reserves and follow-up agencies. The team rapidly made their way to the PVCP, halting on the road some 100 metres to the north. The rear of the lorry was visible outside the base. The terrorists were clearly identified firing into the compound. Corporal Harvey and his men opened fire, hitting the rear of the lorry 5 times. The enemy immediately switched the bulk of their fire onto the patrol, forcing them to dive for cover into the hedgerows to the west of the road. By skillful fire and manoeuvre, the patrol worked its way to a position adjacent to the PVCP, continuing to draw heavy enemy fire and forcing the enemy to withdraw. The lorry was found abandoned at the border, with a 210-kilogram bomb on board. Corporal Harvey and his men came onto the road just as the lorry was disappearing and as Corporal Duncan was trying to revive Private Houston. The 2 corporals, recognizing that the Isuzu van was a bomb, evacuated the base and established the cordon. As the boost charge of the bomb exploded, the first helicopter arrived, bringing in reserves. The casualties were rapidly evacuated and the follow-up began. This was a terrifying close-quarter action, which lasted some 10 minutes. It was a fight for existence. As the Irish Republican Army declared subsequently, they were intent on totally destroying the enemy position. Every man involved acted with exemplary courage and determination to defeat the enemy. The conduct of Corporal Duncan and Corporal Harvey and of Lance Corporal Patterson was in the highest traditions of conspicuous gallantry. By their actions they saved the PVCP. By their actions they fought back at the enemy, fought to regain some initiative, and finally fought off the attack, forcing the terrorists to withdraw prematurely and ensuring their failure. As the Irish Republican Army also stated, the soldiers, despite several demands to surrender, refused to comply, and our active service unit was forced to withdraw, hastened by the presence of a sizable British Army foot patrol. Lance Corporal Patterson and Private Houston died as true soldiers. They died fighting as men, in action, carrying out their duties. The size and type of this attack has never been seen before in Northern Ireland. The events of the Derryard action are a landmark in the modern fighting history of the King's Own Scottish borderers.
The following is an extract of an account of the attack written by the former CO in 2019 on the 30th anniversary for the regimental magazine of the KOSB. Names have been redacted.
No one had the faintest clue about the scale of the attack the IRA had put together. Yes, we knew about the Libyan weapons, but to this day no one has ever confirmed to me that there was any inkling within intelligence circles that the IRA would use the full range of weaponry and explosives in such a way. At that time of the year the daylight faded quickly. The IRA attacked Derryard at approximately 16:20 hours, and as we discovered it was almost pitch black by 1700 hours. And then of course the first contact report came into main operations. As a lot of us know from endless training and then endless tours, when there is a contact, a number of response systems at different levels need to and have to snap into action instantly, and these actions have to be correct. If anything could stretch these responses and procedures to breaking point, then Derryard was it. I would be lying if I said I could remember exactly what happened, but these are my recollections. I had a brilliant main headquarters team. The adjutant called me into the operations room, and with the operations officer, we quickly talked everything through. All the functions had kicked into gear, and my overriding need was to get out to Derryard. X and Y had scrambled the quick reaction force and were handling the operational needs, both upwards to Headquarters 3 Brigade and downwards to the companies and other static call signs. G would provide the top cover and guidance once I had left. B and the intelligence cell were tapping into all the Royal Ulster Constabulary and Special Branch channels to try and get an understanding of what had and was happening. The regimental signals officer and all the signallers were keeping everything connected. Meanwhile, C and the clerical team under D were making sure everything was being recorded and were liaising closely with Echelon at St. Angelo. E and his small medical team were standing by. They knew they were in for a tough time. I had to get to Derryard, but the priority for the Lynxes was to get more jocks into the area and get the casualties out. I remember my awful feelings of anger and hurt as the casualties and some of the survivors were helped off the first helicopter back from Derryard and taken into the tender care of the medics, from where they were later airlifted to Musgrave Park Hospital. I will keep those sights and thoughts to myself because they were terrible. It was obvious Rosslea was the focus, so X drove the two of us there in our covert car, from where we joined the next reinforcements and lifted off. Then we landed just outside the base at Derryard, and as I moved towards the PVCP, my heart almost stopped. The base was wrecked and smouldering in the frosting, darkening light.
One thing that struck me in the Sears account was when he wrote, "For the terrorist, it was a soft target, being tactically indefensible, poorly protected and manned with a minimum of weaponry." The Army's failure to equip, man and protect an isolated position is something that would be repeated in numerous FOBs in Afghanistan 20 years later. During my tour of Londonderry in 1988, which we discussed in podcast 7, we also had to man an exposed PVCP. This was a checkpoint on Macrana Road near Londonderry, which was staffed by 8 soldiers, a member of the Women's Royal Army Corps who operated the Vengeful computer system, which was used to track vehicle movements, and a soldier from the RMP. There were 2 Sangers equipped with a light machine gun, and the remainder of us had SLRs. Vision in the 2 Sangers was limited as the observation slits were protected by sliding metal plates, and the main road cut through the checkpoint. I always felt vulnerable there and happy when our 10-day stint was up. My fear was justified after our tour when on the 24th of October 1990, the IRA took the family of Patrick Gillespie hostage. Gillespie lived in the Chantallo area of Londonderry and worked as a cook at the Fort George British Army base in the city, and had been warned to stop working at the base or risk reprisals. The terrorists then chained him to a vehicle packed with 450 kilograms of explosives and made him drive to the checkpoint. Despite Gillespie's efforts to warn the soldiers, the IED detonated, killing him and 5 others from the King's Regiment. After the attack on Derryard, Corporal Robert Duncan and Lance Corporal Ian Harvey were awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal. As a side note, in the aftermath of the 1993 review of the British Honour System, which formed part of the drive to remove distinctions of rank in respect of awards for bravery, the DCM was discontinued and replaced by the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross as a second-level award for gallantry. Lance Corporal Patterson received a posthumous mention in dispatches for his actions that night. The checkpoint was dismantled in March 1991 as part of a major border security rearrangement codenamed Operation Mutilate. In order to counter the overmatch of weapon systems experienced at Derryard, PVCPs were then equipped with GPMGs and a UOR was put in to procure a rifle grenade. The following account is from the Frontline Ulster website. Officially designated grenade rifle 40mm heat anti-armour L74A1, the Lockheed design grenade offers something that did not exist previously, a lightweight, quick-to-deploy armour-piercing capability. The high-explosive anti-tank warhead utilised a small, high-explosive charge and a metallic cone liner to form a high-velocity slug when fired, capable of penetrating light armour that the IRA seemed intent on deploying. Designed for infantry use, the L74A1 grenade fitted over the muzzle of the S80 rifle and was fired by discharging a live round into the base of the grenade body. The body contained a bullet catcher capable of containing the fired round and a small propellant charge to propel the grenade a short distance to the target. Upon impact, the fuse would detonate the warhead, forming the armour-penetrating slug and destroying the target. A second variant of the rifle grenade from Lockheed was also brought into service, the L75A1 APAV anti-personnel anti-vehicle. The difference being the warheads, with the APAV containing less armour-penetrating ability, but with the inclusion of a fragmentation ring around the warhead for anti-personnel effects. The L74A1 was in service from 1990 until 1996, when it was replaced by an Israeli-designed rifle grenade designated the L86 Rifle Grenade general service. My book recommendation this week is The IRA by Tim Pat Coogan, which I mentioned at the start of the pod. First published in 1971, it's had numerous updates and reprints since then, and I've got the 1995 edition. It's a bit of a doorstopper at nearly 700 pages long, but it's a comprehensive and very detailed read, described by the Times as a very sensible and fair-minded assessment of a uniquely controversial organisation. The trouble with the troubles, if you pardon the pun, is by the very nature of the conflict, it often provokes a binary choice in people, who then miss the varying shades of grey. The old cliché, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, is very much still in play. That's it for another episode. Thanks for listening and your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube and Twitter. And if you download us from iTunes and like the podcast, it would be great if you leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcast from. And we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.